Welcome, intrepid seekers of the unknown. I am so pleased you have decided to join me here at Graves' End. I am your guide through the shadows, Mr. Rob Graves, the keeper of artifacts that whisper tales lost to time. Whether you have returned here or are joining us for the first time, then that means you have an insatiable curiosity and are eager to know more about the many artifacts I have discovered, not just down here, but buried with the departed. I would be remiss if I did not remind you of the threat that looms should you choose to learn their secrets. The Silent Company's reach is endless. If you wish to proceed, then take heed, as our tale tonight is ripe with bloodshed and pain. Very well. Let the undying radiance illuminate our path. Together, we will uncover this grave secret. Prepare, for the gates of the unknown are creeping open, and the echoes of forgotten stories beckon. This is Grave Secrets Unearthed, where the past comes alive and the shadows speak. Tonight's tale is titled The Malevolent Melody. A violin. Seemingly innocuous at first glance, but looks can be deceiving, can't they? This one holds within it a dark and malevolent power, one that has left a trail of death and destruction in its wake. And yet, despite the danger it poses, there's an undeniable allure to the instrument, a magnetic pull that compels you to listen. What emotions stir within you when you hear its haunting melody? When played skillfully, one might find themselves enveloped in a sense of tranquility. Yet, should its strings be manipulated improperly, the consequences can be dire. Great care must be taken when one owns a violin. It needs to be tuned, its bow rosined and re-haired every so often, its varnish touched up. This one is looking a little worse for wear. It looks emaciated and sick, and sometimes, I swear, I can even hear it whispering to be fed. But enough speculation. Let us delve deeper and uncover the truth behind its enigmatic power. This violin has been enchanting its way through the annals of history for well over 500 years, wreaking havoc in its wake, and now sits with me within Graves' End. The Undying Radiance has shared with me the tale, so let me tell you about its last owner. Her name was Lilith Hawthorne, a young woman in her early 20s, with flowing dark hair, framed a face that seemed to hide countless secrets behind its serene facade. Her eyes, a captivating blue, hold a touch of sorrow, hinting at a tumultuous inner world. Despite her beauty, there's a sense of vulnerability about her, a silent plea for understanding that lingers in the air. Lilith grew up with a mother and a father, an older brother and a younger sister. Her family were neither rich nor poor, but they always wanted the best for their children. Well, at least the first and the last child. Lilith, however, got forgotten about quite often. Birthdays, special occasions, and holidays. Her older brother, Alexander, ever the overachiever, tended to leave Lilith alone for the most part, especially as he got older. He excelled in schooling and was always helpful, at least when it benefited him most. Lilith's younger sister, Sophia, seemed to be good at anything she decided to do, but the one thing she seemed to be the best at was piano. Lilith's father treated her brother and sister like a star, and as for Lilith's mother, her mother just seemed to seethe with rage around Lilith, and no matter what she did, she was always finding herself on bad terms with her. Poor Lilith. It must be hard to be ignored and unappreciated. She was always being blamed for things. Her brother and sister tormented her. However, on days where she was left alone in the house, as the family went to social gatherings, often forgetting to even tell her about them, Lilith would find solace in her violin. Her favorite spot to play was in the attic of her family's home. She knew that she would be left alone, and often found herself visiting the attic just to get away. Lilith's mother hated the sound of the violin. Any hint of bow to string and she would be screeching from the bottom of the stairs for her to stop. Lilith did have one person who paid attention to her, though, and that was Lucia Moretti. Lilith and Lucia had grown up together despite their different social standings their families held. Lilith's father was a banker, while Lucia's worked as a painter. He had a little art stand in town in which to sell his works. Lilith always felt more comfortable with the Morettis than she did her own family. They were more encouraging and supportive of her interests, especially in music. Lucia, being a talented artist, often traded paintings for Lilith's musical performances, creating a bond between them that transcended their social differences. Despite their friendship, Lilith couldn't help but feel envious of Lucia's freedom and creativity, something she longed for in her own life. Lilith's fingers danced across the strings of her violin, weaving a melody that echoed through the tranquil setting under the shade of an old oak tree. Beside her, Lucia deftly applied strokes of paint to her canvas, capturing the essence of their peaceful sanctuary. "Your music always enchants me, Lilith," Lucia remarked, her eyes alight with admiration. Lilith nodded appreciatively, a flicker of longing in her gaze. "I wish I shared your enthusiasm, Lucia," Lilith confessed, her voice tinged with a hint of envy. "Sophia will be playing the piano at the Kelowna home tonight to celebrate Alexander's announcement on entering the election as High Magistrate in the courts," she added, her tone betraying a touch of resentment. "I just hope I'll get a chance to play my violin as well." The thought lingered in Lilith's mind, adding to her anticipation and uncertainty about the evening ahead. The girls said their goodbyes, and Lilith headed home. As she walked through the streets, she thought she would pass by Lucia's father's art stand, just to have a look. As Lilith neared, she could see him with a customer. They were deep in conversation, and Lilith could make out a slight look of apprehension on his face while speaking. She couldn't see the customer's face, but they were holding something in front of them, draped with a cloth. They seemed to be pressing it into Lucia's father's hands. Lilith gave a wave when she caught his eye, and he quickly dashed the item below the table while the customer walked away, disappearing into the busy street. Lucia's father gave a sort of embarrassed wave and told her to hurry home before it gets dark. The sun had just begun to set when Lilith reached home. Upon entering, she could hear her father and brother speaking loudly in the library, no doubt indulging themselves before tonight's celebration. Lilith raced past the library entrance and up the stairs to her bedroom, intent on dressing herself for the occasion. Before going to her room, she checked to make sure the hallway was clear. Reaching up and pulling on the string to the attic, being careful not to make too much noise. As the stairs tumbled out, Lilith gave another look around and hurried up the wooden steps. Glancing around the dark attic, Lilith stashed her violin and bow beside some old chairs and threw a nearby sheet over top. Content that it was hidden, she went back down the stairs and closed up the attic door, the string slipping from her grasp and thumping back into the ceiling. As she turned to head back to her bedroom, Lilith could have sworn something darted into a nearby room out of the corner of her eye. Opening her mouth to call out to it, when suddenly her mother yelled from the bottom of the stairs to stop the noise. Lilith rolled her eyes at the obvious hypocrisy, as she felt the noise from the attic door paled in comparison to her screeching. Glancing once more to the open room, where she saw something move, she shook her head and made her way to the bedroom. With the instrument safely hidden away, she turned her attention to getting dressed for the evening's celebration. As she rummaged through her wardrobe, her thoughts were consumed by the events of the day and the impending festivities. Once she had selected an appropriate outfit, Lilith quickly changed and checked her appearance in the mirror. Satisfied with her outfit of choice, she made her way back out into the hallway, her mind already drifting to the night ahead. But as she stepped out of her room and glanced down the hallway, a sense of unease washed over her. There, Extending into the hallway were the attic stairs, pulled down as if taunting her. Lilith rose in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat at the sight. She could have sworn she had put the attic stairs back up after hiding her violin. The memory of closing the attic door flashed through her mind, and she felt a knot form in the pit of her stomach. Her pulse quickening, Lilith hesitated for a moment before summoning the courage to approach the stairs. With each step she took, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, filled with a palpable sense of dread. Lilith stood before the open staircase, her heart pounding in her chest as she gazed up into the dark void above. Summoning her courage, Lilith ascended the stairs, each creak echoing through the silent hallway. As she reached the top, she found herself standing in the dimly lit attic, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. Her eyes scanned the space, searching for any sign of movement or intrusion. But aside from the faint glow of the setting sun now filtering through a small window, the attic was eerily still. Feeling a shiver run down her spine, Lilith took a hesitant step forward, her senses on high alert. Something felt wrong. She hurriedly walked to where she had put her violin. Pulling back the sheet she covered it with yielded an empty space. Panic-stricken, her chest tightening, and her breathing becoming more erratic, Lilith's eyes darted around the room. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, her gaze fell upon a familiar shape in the corner of the attic. There, nestled among boxes and clutter, lay her beloved violin, its once pristine form now marred by a cruel act of destruction. Shock and disbelief washed over Lilith as she approached the instrument, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. Her bow snapped in half, the hair falling from it loosely. The wood of its frame was splintered, the strings torn asunder, rendering the violin nothing more than a broken shell of its former self. Tears welled up in Lilith's eyes as she realized the extent of the damage. Someone had deliberately destroyed her violin, shattering not just an object, but a piece of her soul. In that moment, a wave of emotions crashed over her. Anger, sadness, mingling with a deep sense of betrayal. Of course, she knew who it was, but the question of why screamed in her mind. Lilith's initial shock turns to seething rage. She clenches her fists, feeling a surge of betrayal and fury wash over her. Determined to confront her sister about the malicious act, Lilith storms out of the attic and marches down the hallway to Sophia's bedroom. Without bothering to knock, Lilith barges in, her expression cold and wrathful. Sophia looks up in surprise, but her face quickly morphs into a smirk as she sees her sister's enraged demeanor. "What do you want, Lilith?" Sophia taunts, her voice dripping with malice. Lilith's hands tremble as she points accusingly at Sophia. "You did this," she seethes, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You broke my violin." Sophia's smirk widens as she shrugs nonchalantly. "So what if I did?" she retorts, her tone laced with cruelty. "It's not like you deserved it anyway, and you know how much Mother hates the noise. I'm just doing the family a favor." Lilith's fists clench even tighter, her nails digging into her palms. She struggles to contain the torrent of anger threatening to consume her. "How could you?" she hisses, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're despicable, Sophia. Truly despicable." Sophia's laughter fills the room, grating on Lilith's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, spare me the melodrama, Lilith," she scoffs. "You're just upset because I ruined your precious little toy. Well, too bad. Maybe now you'll learn your place." With a final glare of contempt, Lilith storms out of Sophia's room, her heart heavy with betrayal and resentment. She knows that this rift between them runs deep, and she wonders if the relationship can ever be repaired. But for now, all she can do is nurse her wounds and steel herself against the cruelty of her own flesh and blood. Lilith's mind races with conflicting emotions as she stands in the hallway, her sister's scathing words echoing in her head. The thought of facing her family, especially Sophia at the party, fills her with dread and despair. She knows that the celebration will be a reminder of the shattered dreams and fractured relationships. In a moment of impulse, fueled by hurt and anger, Lilith makes a decision. Without a backwards glance, she rushes down the stairs and out the front door, the cool night washing over her. She doesn't know where she's going or what lies ahead, but she knows that she can't bear to stay in this suffocating atmosphere any longer. With each step she takes, Lilith feels a sense of liberation wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she feels free from the constraints of her family's expectations and the weight of their disapproval. As the moon begins its climb into the night sky, she finds solace, knowing that she's finally taking control of her own destiny. As she disappears into the shadows of the streets, Lilith leaves behind the echoes of her broken past, determined to forge a new path for herself, one where she can find true happiness and fulfillment on her own terms. Reality is quick to set in, however. Where is she going to go? Where will she lay her head at night? How will she eat and take care of herself? In her impulsiveness, Lilith failed to take anything from the home to aid in her newfound freedom. Lilith continued walking as she thought of somewhere, anywhere to go. Her mind sparked at the realization of a potential destination. The moon had only just begun its rise, and if she hurried, she could make it to Lucia's father's art stand in town. She started towards the market, Lilith's heart pounding in her chest as she walked at a quickened pace. She spots the quaint art stand nestled in a small corner of the market street. A comforting flicker of candlelight assures her that Lucia's father was still there. As she approaches, she can hear a hushed conversation coming from just inside his tented stand. Lilith is only able to make out a few words. "We listen." Not understanding, and knowing it is none of her business, Lilith cautiously and with hesitation in her voice calls out, "Mr. Moretti? Are you in there?" A silence befell inside the tent, and after a brief moment, Mr. Moretti draws back the canvas curtain and stares at Lilith with confusion. "Lilith, what brings you here at this hour?" "Lucia told me you were attending a party to celebrate your brother's upcoming election." Lilith pushed past Lucia's father, and without hesitation, her words began tumbling out. She recounted the events of the evening, the shattered violin, the betrayal of her sister, and the overwhelming sense of despair she feels any time she is at home. As Lilith pours out her heart to Lucia's father, he listens with a mixture of sympathy and concern, his brow furrowing as he takes in the gravity of her words. Sensing the depth of Lilith's despair, he rises from his seat and disappears into the shadows of the art stand, returning moments later with an item covered by a cloth. "Lilith, my dear," he begins, his voice gentle yet hesitant. "This violin belonged to my late wife. She was a talented musician, much like yourself. I believe she would want you to have it." With a noticeable tremble in his hands, Lucia's father removes the cloth, revealing the exquisite instrument. Its deep, resonant color shimmers in the candlelight, and Lilith can't help but be captivated by its beauty. I can't," Lilith stammers, her eyes welling with tears. "It's too much." But Lucia's father insists, placing the violin and bow in her hands. "Consider it a gift, a token of hope and resilience. May it bring you the same joy and solace that music has always brought to my family." Accepting the violin, Lilith feels a rush of emotions: gratitude, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. As she gently runs her fingers over the strings, she knows that this violin will carry her through the darkest of times. Unknown to Lilith, however, the undying radiance allows me to see Lucia's father watching her with a mixture of apprehension and concern. He knows the true origin of this violin, a gift from a mysterious benefactor, but for now, he keeps this knowledge to himself, hoping that it will bring comfort to Lilith in her time of need. Ultimately, I fear this violin will do the exact opposite. Lilith bids farewell to Lucia's father, but not before he suggests that she should head back home. Lilith was not going to be going home, though. She was going straight to the party where she knew her family would be. They probably didn't even realize she wasn't with them. Her new violin in hand, Lilith felt like she was gliding down the streets towards the Kelowna home. She stopped at a nearby lamplight. Tucking the bow under her chin, Lilith examined the violin admiringly. She looked it over, turning it in her hands as she did. She plucked some of the strings and was delighted to hear that it was already tuned. As she looked, she noticed a carving just near the scroll. She ran her thumb over it and narrowed her eyes. It was a simple design of a dagger. She stared at it quizzically before noticing another symbol carved into the side of the violin. This one of a drop, maybe a water drop or a teardrop, Lilith thought. Her curiosity now piqued. She scoured the violin for more symbols. Lilith only found one more, but it was partially hidden under the chin rest of the violin. But, from what she could tell, it looked like a knot of some kind. As Lilith delighted in the design of her new violin, her fingers began tracing the carvings. She traced each one with her forefinger. First, the parts of the knot she could see under the chin rest. Then, she slid her hand up to the droplet symbol, and then finally to the dagger near the scroll. As her finger grazed the design, she noticed an additional tuner attached. It didn't appear to be bound by any strings, and with her curiosity already overwhelming her, she turned the unattached tuner. To her surprise, it started to come loose. She twisted it all the way off, revealing a small capsule-like compartment. And just sticking out the end of it was a piece of old weathered parchment. She pulled the parchment out and unfurled it, revealing 3 tremolo notes written in faded ink, each one ascending in pitch. Lilith was hit with an overwhelming sense of urge to play this short melody. Studying the score and content with its simplicity, she quickly returned it to its initial hiding place. She removed the bow from under her chin, brought the violin up, and in the lamplight placed her fingers on the strings. She brought the bow up, took a deep breath, and began to play the short melody. As she hung on the last note, Lilith could swear she felt the violin vibrate. She pulled the bow off the strings and exhaled deeply. Lilith's heart beat wildly in her chest, and she could feel something well up inside her. Something she hadn't felt for a long time. Confidence. Lilith could feel her confidence renewed, and with it, she began to play. She closed her eyes, let the music flow. She moved as she played and completely left the world behind. She played like she had never played before. Every emotion poured out of her through the strings of the violin. When she finished, she opened her eyes and saw several passers-by had stopped to admire. A nearby gentleman wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. Lilith witnessed a couple embracing and swaying gently despite the music stopping, as they stared longingly into each other's eyes. Others stared at Lilith and softly clapped. Lilith looked around her, and where she would normally feel embarrassment, she once again was filled with confidence. She had never played that well, or had gotten so lost in the music before. She took a small bow before remembering that she was on her way to the party. She left the small group of people and rushed off to her destination. Lilith arrived at the Kelowna family's house. She could see many people through the windows of the main room. It appeared as if Sophia was playing piano for a crowd. Opening the front door, Lilith stepped into the grand foyer of the large family house. The elegant strains of Sophia's piano playing echoed through the opulent halls. Straightening her posture and clutching her new violin and bow tightly, Lilith walked with purpose towards the main room where the music emanated. With each step, her resolve solidified, her determination shining brightly in her eyes. Upon entering the main room, Lilith saw Sophia just finishing her performance at the piano. Ignoring the disapproving glances from some members of the family, Lilith approached the center of the room confidently. Her mother reached out to grasp Lilith's arm and pull her away from what she was about to do, but she was able to slip her mother's grip, and with a graceful flourish, she raised her violin to her chin, poised to play. Before Lilith could draw the bow across the strings, a stern voice cut through the air, demanding her attention. It belonged to her father, his expression grave as he warned Lilith at the consequences of her actions. But Lilith remained undeterred, her fingers itching to unleash the melodies trapped within her that were begging to be played. A sense of anticipation filled the room, her fingers poised delicately over the strings. With a soft exhale, she began to play, each note a gentle caress that wove its way through the air, suffusing the room with a sense of warmth and tranquility. As the music flowed from Lilith's instrument, a wave of euphoria swept over the gathered guests, their faces softening into expressions of bliss. Some closed their eyes, lost in the melody, while others swayed gently to the rhythm, their spirits lifted by the soothing strains. Even Lilith's mother, who typically had little patience for music, found herself entranced by the beauty of her daughter's playing. A soft smile graced her lips as she listened, her usual stern demeanor softened by the enchanting melody. Alexander stood near an entryway, his arms folded across his chest, and a grin on his face. As he caught Lilith's eye, he bowed respectfully. And then there was Sophia, Lilith's younger sister, who had previously shattered her old violin in an act of cruelty. Despite their strained relationship, even she couldn't deny the power of Lilith's music. As she listened, a sense of remorse washed over her, mingling with the joy and wonder that filled the room. As Lilith continued to play, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly enchanted, each note a testament to the transformative power of her music. And though the evening would eventually come to an end, the memory of Lilith's performance would linger, a beacon of light in the darkness of the evening's prior events. As the undying radiance cast its ethereal glow upon the forgotten memories of Lilith Hawthorne, I find myself transported to a collection of memories, witnessing the days that followed her enchanting performance at the Colonna family home. In those fleeting moments, I watched as Lilith, emboldened by the euphoria her music had evoked, embraced her newfound gift with unwavering determination. With her violin in hand, she became a beacon of light in the somber streets of her town, her melodies weaving a tapestry of hope and joy for all who listened. But, as the weeks wore on, a subtle shift began to take hold. The once vibrant hues of her violin's varnish began to fade, mirroring the dimming of her own spirit. After a month, and with each passing day, her music lost some of its enchanting allure, the notes faltering where once they had soared. As the color drained from her violin, so too did the warmth from Lilith's family. No longer the center of attention, she found herself relegated once more to the shadows, her talents dismissed and forgotten. Lilith's pallor and general health seemed to fade along with it. And as I witnessed the gradual unraveling of Lilith's newfound happiness, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for the young woman whose light had been extinguished too soon. Yet, among the darkness, a flicker of hope remained, a glimmer of possibility that perhaps Lilith would find her way back to the music that set her soul ablaze. Lilith sat alone in the attic. Tears streaked her face. She held her violin and rubbed the side of her face, a bruise forming on her cheekbone. She had dared to play her violin in her bedroom a little too loudly. Her mother stormed into Lilith's bedroom, and without so much as a warning, struck her on the face with the back of her hand. She screeched at her to stop playing that wretched instrument, before turning on her heel to leave the bedroom, revealing Sophia's smirking face as she watched from the hallway. Lilith's tears welled in her eyes as she stood and pushed past Sophia towards the attic. Poor Lilith. Sophia's voice followed Lilith down the hallway. How gracefully you soared, only to come crashing back down. Lilith pulled the attic stairs down with some difficulty and retreated up them without saying a word. Lilith stared at her violin, which had lost its luster. The once smooth brown and red varnish was now a dry and dull gray, and no matter how much varnish she put on it to return it to its former glory, it never seemed to take. For the week that the violin had been in this state, Lilith had lost the talent to play. She could barely find the energy to get through the day, and she was unable to string together 3 notes. Every time she tuned it, when she went to play, it was all out of tune again. People seemed to recoil in horror when she would attempt to play. Those on the street spit and threw things at her. Even Lucia, her best friend, winced and told Lilith that she should quit playing and find something else to do. Lucia's words were so hard to hear that Lilith hadn't spoken to her friend since. Lilith wiped at the tears that had fallen on the face of the violin. It felt rougher than it did yesterday. She traced her fingers on the violin, wondering what was wrong. As her fingers dragged on the rough surface, she caught a rough edge near the carving of the dagger. She recoiled and drew her finger up to examine it. Some of her skin had been peeled up from the splintering wood. Frustration set in as Lilith once again attempted to tune the violin, and she began plucking deftly at the strings. The moment she started, she could hear the tune go out of the strings, and in desperation, she began plucking faster and harder. Overwhelmed with frustration, she slid her finger down on a string, feeling it slice open. Instinctively, she drew her finger to her lip and tasted the familiar copper taste of blood. She removed her finger and stared at it as more blood began to form along the slice in her finger. A blood droplet formed. Before she could catch the blood droplet on her lips, it plopped onto the violin. She stared at the blood on the body of her instrument. It slowly dripped down the front, and in its trail, the sheen of the violin returned. Lilith couldn't believe what she was witnessing, and thought it just to be a trick of the light, something she wanted to see so badly. She glanced at her finger, blood now covering the face of it. She began to rub the fresh blood from her wound on the violin, and to her astonishment, the violin's fresh polish returned to the affected area. Delighted to see the violin return to its former glory, Lilith pressed her finger into a different area and attempted to smear more blood along its surface, but nothing happened. Looking at her fingertip, she realized the blood flow had stopped. Such a small cut only yielded a tiny amount. However, Lilith was determined at this point to see what would happen. She recalled the symbol of a dagger, and what she understood now must be a blood droplet rather than a water droplet carved into her violin. Lilith searched the attic for something sharp. Was she really about to cut herself to rub blood on an instrument? Lilith's eyes settled on a jagged piece of wood. It was a piece of her old violin. She picked up the shard and pricked her finger on it to test its sharpness. She winced as the wood pierced her skin and yielded a tiny drop, which she quickly spread on the violin's surface. She needed more than that, and she knew it. With a steadying breath, Lilith opened her left hand, palm up. She pressed the jagged piece of wood hard into her skin. Closing her eyes and sucking air through her teeth, she quickly pulled the wood across her palm, the warm liquid spilling into her hand. She breathed erratically as she stared at the flow of blood and began to feel lightheaded. She splatted her hand on the surface of the violin and began to rub it in, covering the entirety of it, until it looked the way it had when she first received it. Satisfied with her work, Lilith tore a strip off a nearby sheet and wrapped it around her hand, squeezing it tightly to stop any remaining blood flow. Lilith felt renewed and more alert than she had felt all week. She gazed at her violin longingly, and without hesitation, picked up her bow and began to play. The strings were tuned, her fingerwork was immaculate, and the bow slid effortlessly across the strings. It was like old times, and Lilith walked out of the attic, playing as she did. She strode through the hallway playing, passing Sophia's room, who stood in the doorway entranced by her music, smiling as Lilith walked by. She played down the stairs where her mother stood at the foot. She smiled and closed her eyes, embracing the sound coming from the violin. Lilith walked past the library where she knew her father would be, and continued to play. Her father sat in his chair, swaying gently as if feeling every note. After finishing her performance, the entire family gathered around Lilith. Feeling empowered, she decided to assert herself for the first time. "Sophia," she began softly, catching her sister's attention. "Clean my bedroom," Lilith stated sternly, surprising Sophia, who nodded and left without a word. No defiance, no resentful glances. Turning to her mother, Lilith continued, "Mother, I need a new violin case. Get one for me." Her mother bowed her head obediently, promising to fetch it right away. As her mother exited through the front door, Lilith shifted her gaze to her father, who rose from his chair in submission. Smirking in a manner reminiscent of Sophia, Lilith addressed him. "Father, I would like for you to find me a theater to play in. I want a full house." Her father responded eagerly, "Yes, of course. I will book you in one of the finest theaters." With that, he hurried off to make the arrangements, leaving Lilith admiring her violin with a sense of satisfaction. 1 week later, and Lilith stood behind a curtain. Just beyond it, the audience murmured in anticipation of the performance. Lilith's father booked the theater for a 2-night sold-out performance. The prior day's shows were received with thunderous applause, tears of joy, flowers, gifts, and money. But most importantly to Lilith was the approval from everyone. As the anticipation built and the theater hushed, awaiting her performance, Lilith felt a wave of excitement and nervousness wash over her. The curtain raised, and Lilith stared into the audience. The moment the first notes left her violin, however, she knew something was terribly wrong. The once melodious tones now sounded off, discordant and unpleasant. She glanced down at her instrument in alarm, noticing the colors fading before her eyes, the once vibrant reds and browns turning dull and lifeless. But with each passing moment, her playing deteriorated further. The once graceful melodies now a jumbled mess of notes. The audience's initial curiosity turned to confusion, then annoyance, and finally to anger. Murmurs spread through the crowd, growing louder and more hostile by the second. Some began to boo, while others shouted insults and demands for her to stop. Despite her best efforts, Lilith couldn't regain control. The chaos in the theater escalated as people started throwing objects at the stage. The once elegant performance hall evolved into a scene of mayhem and disorder. Patrons began shoving each other, which escalated to full-on fighting, which threatened to overrun the stage. Still, no one came to Lilith's aid. She felt the weight of her father's disappointment like a physical blow as he yelled at her from the crowd, his words cutting deep. With tears streaming down her face, Lilith fled the stage, the sounds of chaos and anger echoing in her ears. She ran out the nearest stage door and through the darkened streets, her heart heavy with shame and humiliation. Lilith slumped against an alley wall, sniffling and wiping the tears from her face. She stared at her violin. She thinks she understood it now. It demanded blood, and it would bring her anything she wanted from whomever listened to her play. But let it drain and go hungry, and it will take everything from you, including your own health. Why had the blood she'd given it only worked for 1 week? When she received it, the color did not start to fade until after a month. Lilith needed to do some testing before she could use the violin's power any further. Looking to her left and finding a discarded glass bottle, Lilith broke it on the ground where she sat. She sliced her hand with a broken piece of the glass and smeared the blood on much like she did before, the color and shine returning. But Lilith, wanting more, cut her other hand, squeezing it out over her violin, much like one would a wet cloth. The pain wasn't as bad as she thought, but maybe she was just desperate. The violin worked as before, and Lilith was able to earn some money playing on the street so she could afford a place to stay at a nearby inn. The Undying Radiance has once again shown a collection of events to me. Lilith's blood-soaked violin indeed only lasts a week, and as she explores the mystery surrounding it, she finds herself drawn into a web of darkness and despair. Each time she plays, she feels a surge of power coursing through her veins, but with it comes a heavy price. The violin demands sacrifice, and Lilith, desperate to maintain her newfound success, obliges. With each performance, she offers up more and more of her own blood, the scars on her hands and body serving as a grim reminder of the toll it takes. At first, the sacrifices seem worth it, as the violin plays beautifully, granting her fame and fortune, if but for a fleeting moment. But as the weeks pass, Lilith begins to feel the weight of her choices bearing down on her. The once vibrant energy that fueled her performances start to wane, replaced by a sense of exhaustion and dread. She knows she can't keep up this charade forever, yet the allure of the violin's power is too strong to resist. Among the whispers of the Undying Radiance, Lilith searches for answers, hoping to unravel the secrets of the malevolent melody that has ensnared her. But with each revelation comes a deeper understanding of the darkness that lies within her own soul. Lilith, still living at the inn, has taken a part-time job at Giovanni's butcher shop, helping clean and run the storefront. Lilith has taken to applying her own blood to the violin each night in order to extend the usage past a week, but the toll is too much. One day, when Giovanni had to leave the shop, Lilith helped herself to a jar of pig's blood from a hog that had been drained and cut up earlier in the morning. She was eager to get back to the inn to apply it to her instrument. The only reason she took this job was to get something else instead of her own blood. She hid the blood in the alleyway just outside the shop and continued her work. The workday finished, Lilith hangs her apron, says goodbye to Giovanni, and leaves at the front door. Lilith hurries to the alleyway to retrieve the jar of hog's blood she left earlier. As she rounds the corner, she senses a presence nearby. In the shadows, she notices a figure standing, watching. Their presence sends a shiver down her spine, but instead of feeling threatened, she feels a sense of curiosity. Approaching cautiously, Lilith can make out the faint outline of the figure's features. Obscured by the dim light, the figure speaks, her voice low and otherworldly. "You seek approval from others, don't you?" they say cryptically. Intrigued, Lilith nods hesitantly. The figure steps forward, revealing a glimpse of their face, which is partially obscured by a mask. "Continue on your path," they encourage. "But know that the blood of animals will not satisfy the instrument's hunger. You must seek other means to fulfill its desires." With those words, the figure fades back into the shadows, leaving Lilith to contemplate their cryptic message. Unsure of what to make of the encounter, she retrieves the jar of blood and hurries back to the inn. The encounter weighing heavily on her mind. I must interject, dear listeners, that I had not anticipated the Silent Company's involvement when I chose the instrument as a story to share. This revelation weighs heavy on me. I have no doubt now that Lilith is merely a pawn in their grand scheme, manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. As I delve deeper into her tale, I fear what other secrets may be lurking in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed. With a mixture of determination and trepidation, Lilith locked the front door of her room at the inn, ensuring her privacy. Placing the jar of hog's blood on the end table, she moved with purpose to retrieve her violin from its hiding place under the bed. As she grasped the instrument, she couldn't shake the feeling that it seemed somehow different, as if it were afflicted by some unseen malady. Lilith's heart quickened with anticipation as she placed the violin on the bed. Its once vibrant wood now faded and weathered. With trembling hands, she unscrewed the lid of the jar, releasing the metallic scent of blood into the air. Without hesitation, she dipped her fingers into the viscous liquid, splattering it onto the violin's base in haphazard strokes. Closing her eyes, Lilith focused on the rhythmic movement of her hands, the sensation of the blood coating the violin's surface. In her mind's eye, she envisioned a brighter future, filled with adoration and acclaim. As she worked, a sense of euphoria washed over her, momentarily eclipsing the doubts and fears that lingered in the recesses of her mind. With each stroke of her hand, the violin began to shimmer once more, its former brilliance slowly returning. Lilith's smile widened as she emptied the jar, ensuring that every last drop of blood was used to restore her beloved instrument. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of connection, as if she were breathing new life into the very essence of her artistry. It was a feeling akin to nurturing a newborn, a sense of boundless potential and infinite possibility. With the hog's blood doing exactly what she needed, and with an unlimited supply promised from Giovanni's butcher shop, providing she does not get caught, Lilith was able to brush off any lingering doubts. The stranger's words seemed nothing more than a fleeting shadow in the bright promise of her violin's rejuvenation. She headed out the door of the inn, eager to impart her music on the town. Returning to her room at the inn, Lilith felt a heavy weight of defeat settling upon her shoulders. She placed her violin on the bed, its despondent appearance mirroring her own sense of hopelessness. The hog's blood only lasted 20 minutes. As she brushed aside a remnant of the chaos outside from her hair, she couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that lingered in the air. Sitting at the edge of her bed, she stared blankly at her instrument, contemplating her next move in the face of such adversity. From her window, she caught a glimpse of the aftermath of the chaos she unwittingly unleashed in the street below. Overturned vegetable stands, brawls erupting between once friendly acquaintances, and a general air of animosity among the townsfolk painted a grim picture of the consequences of her failed attempt to use the violin. Lilith began to sob in the dimly lit room, unable to hold back her tears, the weight of her despair weighing heavily on her. Perhaps Lucia was right, she thought. Perhaps it was time to abandon her pursuit of fame. The allure of recognition and adoration now seemed like hollow promises, especially when she hadn't earned a single coin and found herself penniless. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Tentatively, she opened it a crack, only to be confronted by the stern visage of the innkeeper. His crooked nose casting a shadow of disdain, he wasted no time in demanding payment for the evening's lodges. Lilith confessed her inability to pay, offering instead a solemn promise to settle her debt as soon as she could. The innkeeper's response was uncompromising. She had 5 hours to produce the coin or face eviction. The innkeeper turned and left. Lilith closed the door, turning her back and pressing herself against it as it clicked close. She stared at the violin sitting sickly on the bed. Quickly walking over to it, Lilith gripped the neck of her violin with both hands and struck it hard against the ground. The instrument made a loud thump, yet the violin remained intact, and the vibration sent shocks up Lilith's hands and arms, forcing her to drop it. It bounced across the wooden floor. She picked it up hastily and swung it against a wall, smashing the picture frame that was hanging there. Glass shattered as Lilith then attempted to rip the strings from the neck. She placed it between her knees and pulled in vain. the strings not loosening from their home. She sliced her hands and fingers in the process, the blood beginning to drip from her hands, landing on the violin, its shine returning to the affected areas as if mocking her. She once more aimed the violin at the floor, bringing it down with all her might. It hit with a loud, hollow thump. Lilith felt the vibrating shocks reverberate up her hands and arms, again forcing her to relinquish her hold. The violin clattered on the ground. With a scream of anguish, she aimed a kick at the wooden instrument, sending it crashing into the wall across the room. Lilith fell to her hands and knees, breathing heavily. Tears, snot, and drool fell from her face. She stared at the violin laying upside down across the room. She slowly crawled towards it, turning it over in its place. Not a scratch, no dents. The malicious instrument remained stubbornly unscathed. She couldn't keep using her own blood. Animal blood was not effective. What else could she do? Her attention was brought back to reality by another knock at her door. Lilith yelled at the door that she will have the money in 5 hours. "Lilith, it's me," the voice behind the door responded. "Lucia?" Lilith answered. She absent-mindedly wiped at her face and stood up from the floor. She reached the door and opened it, allowing Lucia to enter the room. Lilith looked sheepishly at the floor as Lucia entered. Shutting the door behind her, Lucia stepped forward into the room and turned to face Lilith. She was in no shape to entertain, and there was a noticeable tension in the air, laden with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. The last time they had spoken, Lucia had urged Lilith to relinquish her pursuit of playing the violin. Lilith knew this was a result of the violin's hunger, resulting in her poor playing, which evoked those harsh words from Lucia. Now, as they faced each other once more, the conversation danced delicately around the topic that hung heavily between them. "I've been so worried about you," Lucia said, concerned. Lilith began to cry. "Ever since the theater, I haven't been able to face my family, let alone you. Your words hurt me so much, Lucia." Lucia nodded and wrung her hands together nervously. "I know. I wanted to apologize. I'm so sorry for telling you to stop. I don't know what came over me." Lucia continued to talk, and Lilith walked over to retrieve her instrument from the floor before Lucia saw it. She picked it up and felt a ringing in her ears, drowning out the sound of Lucia speaking. Lucia paced back and forth, still talking, but Lilith was no longer listening. Maybe her answer was right in front of her. Lilith gripped the neck of her violin and walked towards Lucia absent-mindedly, pouring her heart out. Lucia moved towards the window, looking out it as she spoke. Lilith approached behind and raised the violin overhead, bringing it crashing into the back of Lucia's skull with a sickening crack. Lucia's body crumpled at Lilith's feet. Lilith looked at her instrument and noticed its shine had returned from where Lucia's blood had splattered. Dropping the violin by her side, Lilith grinned and relished in the moment that all her problems were about to disappear. 6 months passed, and the blur of memories from the Undying Radiance shows me Lilith thriving. She is the talk of her town. Her name is known to everyone. She sells out theaters night after night, and the money comes pouring in. Her family is kept at a distance. Well, everyone except her brother, Alexander, who has been asking Lilith to play at campaign events and paying her quite well for it. She promptly moves out of the inn and into a villa at the end of town. Her music transcends reality, dear listeners, and sometimes I even feel myself getting caught up in it. This is not where her story ends, I'm afraid. The Undying Radiance shows me a collection of memories once again, so I may gaze closer. Lilith walks along the garden path of her villa, passing her hands through some nearby flowers. The wind blows gently through her hair as she walks. Under her arm, she carries a clear glass jar. She walks through a small iron gate, the hinges creaking only slightly as she opens and closes it. Lilith quietly hums to herself as she rounds a bend down a dirt path a little bit out of sight of her home. She stops at a root cellar to the left of an old oak tree. It was reminiscent of the one Lucia and herself used to sit under. Lilith pulled up the doors and stepped down the steps, closing them behind her. Lilith descended the 20 or more stone steps, hearing only the echo of them reverberate off the wall. Entering into a dimly lit room, Lilith stared at a cabinet shelf of preserves, pulled a jar of jam off the shelf, all the while ignoring the pained screams she could hear since coming down the stairs. She sighed heavily and pulled on the side of the cabinet, opening it up to reveal a hidden room behind it. Lilith slipped behind the cabinet and pulled it closed behind her. She stared across the space and smiled at Lucia, who sat bound to a wooden chair. "I see your mouth gag came loose again, Lucia," Lilith said coldly. She strolled towards Lucia, giggling as she reached her. "Well, that's good, because I brought you some jam. Gotta keep your strength up. I have another performance coming tonight, and I'm going to need some more of your blood." She patted her on the head as Lucia began to cry, pleading with Lilith to let her go. Lilith responded, "Letting you go would mean the end to everything I have ever wanted. You should feel proud to be a part of it." Lilith reminded Lucia that her blood fed her violin for up to 3 weeks, and it was due for another layer. Lilith popped the jar off the jar of jam and brought it to her nose. Strawberry," she exclaimed. She positioned herself in front of Lucia and scooped some jam out with her fingers. With her free hand, she gripped the back of Lucia's hair and pulled it backwards, forcing her face to point up at the ceiling. As Lucia gasped in pain, Lilith dropped some of the jam from her hand into Lucia's mouth. Lucia spat it out at Lilith. A mix of jam and saliva sprayed across Lilith's mouth, chin, and neck. Lilith chuckled as she wiped the expectorant off her face with the back of her hand. There was pain in Lucia's eyes as she gazed at her friend in her deteriorating mental state. When looking at Lucia, I got the sense that she had tried to get through to Lilith many times within the 6 months since being hit on the back of her head by the violin. Lilith had walked across the room to a small table. On it laid a number of instruments, but the one Lilith picked up was a simple butcher knife. Lilith's demeanor had changed as she walked back over to Lucia with the knife in hand, the glass jar once again tucked under her arm. Lilith stopped beside Lucia and placed the jar on the floor. Lucia closed her eyes, knowing what was coming next. How much longer was Lilith going to keep her alive? Lilith placed her hand on top of Lucia's left hand and laced her fingers in between her own. She wrenched it, trying to get her hand to face palm up, as Lucia resisted before feeling too weak to continue. Lilith, taking advantage, sliced a large X shape across Lucia's palm. Lucia cries out in pain as her hand is pulled over the jar on the floor and squeezed, the blood streaming out of the open wound into the jar. Lucia's color drained from her face as Lilith kept tightening her hand around and releasing, promoting more blood to flow from it. Lucia wasn't providing enough blood, however. She had been down here 6 months, and Lilith barely went a week between bleedings. Lucia wished her death. Lilith, frustrated, released her hand and began making cuts along Lucia's arm, attempting to get any blood she could from her. This seemed to work better, as Lilith once again took hold of Lucia's hand and pulled it over the jar. The warm liquid spilled down her arm and off her fingertips. Lucia's breath quickened as she continued to let out cries of pain, as Lilith continued to slice and squeeze the blood out of her. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Lucia passed out. Lilith was able to fill the jar. She closed it and set it aside. She gazed at her friend's still face as she reached out and brushed some of Lucia's brown hair. and she began to think of their times together. Lilith began bandaging Lucia as she started to speak out loud to her friend. For a brief moment, I could swear I saw Lucia open her eyes and shut them before Lilith started to speak. Remember when we would sit under the oak tree, sharing songs for paintings? Life seemed simple in those times for us both. But you didn't know I was the one suffering each time I went home. I never truly shared all of what happened to me, about how my family treated me. I told you some things, not all of them. The only reason I decided to keep you alive like this was because of how much I care about you. I had hoped that you would be a willing participant, and that we could share in this success together. Lilith finished cleaning and bandaging Lucia's wounds. Lilith wanted to keep her here for as long as she could. She picked the jar of blood up off the floor and examined it. She began to walk to the cabinet shelf that served as the hidden entrance. However, on this side of the wall, the shelves were lined with jars of blood. Lilith placed the jar down, opened it up, and mixed an anticoagulant into the blood before resealing and placing it on the shelf with the others. The whole shelf was lined with jars of various sizes, all containing blood. Lilith turned her head, still speaking with Lucia, despite her perceived unconscious state. I don't even need your blood, really, but I just enjoy spending time with you. Lilith walked to a darkened corner of the room. I think I figured out how it all works. The violin, I mean. My own blood gives me a week. Someone else's blood, like yours, gives me 3 weeks. Lilith gazed down at the misshapen pile on the floor in the darkened corner she found herself in. But the blood of those I kill? She nudged something soft with her foot, and an arm fell loosely from the pile. Gives me a month's worth of varnish. Sophia was the first to go. Her and I never got along. She was mean and cruel. I bashed her over the head like I did to you. But I kept going, until I could no longer recognize her. She put up a fight at first. My parents were next. I slit their throats. My mother in the kitchen, and my father in the library. Alexander helped me clean it up. Told everyone they died of smoke inhalation from a blocked chimney after successfully hiding their bodies down here. All Alexander wanted in return was for me to play. So I did. I have one more performance tonight for him and his constituents. After that, I'm sure he will be elected to the High Court. He will have everything he wanted, just like I do. My playing makes everyone who listens do what I want. I'll tell them to appoint him. That will be that. As Lilith said her goodbyes to Lucia in the dimly lit root cellar, she failed to notice Lucia's subtle movements. With a deft maneuver, Lucia had managed to slip one hand out of the ropes that bound her. Unaware of Lucia's newfound freedom, Lilith opened the cabinet and exited the room. Later that night, Lilith took the stage with confidence, her violin singing a beautiful melody that captivated the audience as it did every time she played. Each note cast a spell, drawing them into a world of emotion and wonder. As the music filled the air, it painted vivid images in the minds of the listeners, leaving them spellbound. When Lilith finished her performance, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their admiration evident in every clap and cheer. Lilith basked in the glow of their appreciation, knowing she had moved them deeply with her music. Lilith glanced at her brother, Alexander, just off stage, and she noticed him removing something from both his ears. They looked like clay. Alexander, smiling, walked out on stage and placed his arm around Lilith as the applause continued. Yelling over the applause, Alexander encouraged everyone there to vote for him in the upcoming election, to which he was met with even more applause. Lilith stared at him before finally turning to the audience and bowing as she was instructed to do by her brother. Alexander led her off stage, the applause now fading as she was led backstage and through winding corridors. "Where are we going?" she asked, looking up at her brother, who still had his arm around her, leading her. Alexander looked straight ahead, not acknowledging his sister's inquiry. They pushed through a large set of doors and walked into a pitch-black room. She feels her brother's hand leave her shoulder, and she calls out to him. Lilith's heart quickens in the darkened silence before being interrupted by the spark of a match. The match hovers over a lantern's wick before igniting it fully. The lantern casts its eerie light around the room, and Lilith is able to make out the shapes of people, at least 20, maybe more. Lilith's violin and bow are pulled from her grasp, so quickly that Lilith barely had time to notice. Lilith once more calls out for her brother in panic before feeling someone place their hands around her throat and squeeze. The life of Lilith Hawthorne begins to be squeezed from existence. She gasps and attempts to pull the hands from her throat, but she is restrained by another. With the last gurgles of breath, she succumbs to death. When Lilith's body slumps, a voice nearby asks, "What do we do with her and the instrument?" The last words the undying radiance imparts to me, dear listeners, is one that will forever haunt me, and my only hope is they speak of another. In the last moments of Lilith's memories, I hear the words, "Give her and the violin to the gravedigger." And with that, the undying radiance flashes its familiar orange glow. As I contemplate Lilith's harrowing journey, I am consumed by numerous emotions. The revelation that the gravedigger they spoke of could indeed be Harold sends a chill down my spine. How long has he been entangled with the Silent Company? How deep does their influence run within his veins? These questions gnaw at my mind, stirring a sense of unease that I cannot shake. More questions and more searching needs to be done. Were the items held here in Gravesend in protection from the Silent Company, or in servitude of them? I choose to believe in the former, for in my journeys since Harold's death, I have had run-ins with the Silent Company outside the village. Maybe they are unaware of what is held down here, or maybe they are just biding their time. Whatever the reason, I must be prepared and expand my researches among the numerous artifacts down here. Maybe one of Harold's journals holds an answer. Despite the uncertainty, there is a glimmer of hope that perhaps Harold's allegiance is not as steadfast as it seems. Perhaps, in the depths of his soul, there lingers a shred of humanity that could yet defy the darkness that threatens to consume him. There must be. So, dear seekers of the unknown, beware the shadows and keep your light alive. Until we meet again under the cloak of mystery, this is Mr. Rob Graves bidding you farewell from the depths of the past, and I hope you enjoyed this grave secret.